All right, here we go. Hey guys, Jay from the Craft Whiskey Boys. It's the Whiskey University time again. Now it's going to be beginner style stuff, but I'm going to have some advanced information thrown in there as well. So even if you're a whiskey expert and you're listening to this, there's going to be some good little pearls of wisdom. So we're going to talk today about single versus blends. Obviously the single word, single malt, it's quite synonymous nowadays with Scotland. That obviously wasn't always the case. Single malt itself, malted whiskey itself was invented in Ireland. And over the years, since the 1940s onwards, Scotland's become really, really well known around the world for their single malts. But a single malt can be made anywhere. It can be made in Israel, it can be made in Australia. We've got an Irish single malt here, we've got a Japanese single malt here. Obviously this is bourbon, this is a Scottish single malt. Blend, pot still, Irish single pot still, which is very similar to a single malt, there's just unmalted barley in there also. And here's even an English single malt. The thing I want to talk about though today is the difference between a single and a blend. Now, a blend can be obviously two malts from different distilleries blended together. A bit of information a lot of people don't realize. There's blends and there's blends. Now you can take, for example, in Ireland, there's a guy called Bernard Walsh Whiskies. It's company, he's got the Writer's Tears and the Irishman. He blends single pot still, essentially pot still and malt together. That's a really good way. That's a really good expensive blend. Or if you take two different distilleries and do a blended malt, it's kind of like a single malt, but it's still two malts. The difference is when you get to a blended whiskey, this is where it gets a bit trickier in that you can take ethanol, basically corn-based whiskey, which is called grain whiskey. The difference is that it's distilled right up to like 96%, 94 to 96%. It's so pure and so much ethanol that you don't really get a whole lot of whiskey flavor from it. And you're taking about 80 to 90% in a lot of cases of basically pure ethanol. I mean, corn ethanol is what they use as a biofuel. I mean, that's in 98% of all fuel pumps across America, across the world, is ethanol, right? So they're taking that, this pretty much the same product, and then putting anywhere from 20 to 10% of malt. This one here, Conor McGregor's Proper 12, for example, that's one of those style of blends. It's made up of Bushmills. It's got about 80+%, some say up to 90%. I don't know the exact blend, I'm not privy to it, but it's around 80+% of basically corn-based ethanol, like that grain whiskey. So initially, back in the day, when you go back to the 1700s, all the way through when Irish invented whiskey, it was just malt. People weren't really blending at that point in time. Blends came in a little bit later in the 1800s, late 1800s. And the reason why was that people figured out that what they could do is that they could buy some really cheap whiskey, because different quality whiskeys had different prices. For example, Dublin whiskey was the most expensive whiskey in the market. That was the gold standard, the pure, the champagne and sparkling wines, as I always tend to say. And what people would do is they'd buy that Dublin whiskey and they'd buy it, and say they buy 1 barrel, and then they'd go and buy 10 barrels of really, really cheap provincial whiskey, country whiskey, stuff that wasn't made in the big facilities in Dublin. You gotta remember, Dublin industrialized whiskey, they got it to a point where they were able to keep it consistent, make it in big factories, whereas down in the country in Ireland, for example, with the provincial whiskey was made in, the hills, much like up in the Highlands in Scotland, and it was like families making it out in their shed, and it didn't have the same quality controls, it had more fusel oils, it wasn't as palatable. So they take maybe 10 barrels of that stuff and maybe 1 barrel of this and mix them together, and then all of a sudden they've got this whiskey that they could call Dublin whiskey. And anyway, what happened was that Johnny Walker came into the market and got very, very clever. And what Johnny Walker did was they said, to get people interested from a marketing perspective in blends over malts and single malts, is like, why would you drink a single malt, just one malt from one distillery, when you could go to the best 5 distilleries in Scotland and grab all that whiskey and put it together and make this one supreme super whiskey? And that was their marketing pitch, and people fell for it and they went forward. Now that would have been great if that's what they were doing. If they were taking 5 single malts from the best distilleries in Scotland and turned it into one blended malt, then by all means, but that's not what they were doing. What they were doing is they were taking this coffee still that basically takes corn. In Scotland, in Ireland they use corn, in America they use corn, in Scotland they tend to use more wheat. But either way, they're taking this still and they're making basically pure ethanol, pretty much close. The coffee still will distill a spirit right up to like 98% proof. Now they tend to bring it up to 94 to 96% proof, but either way, it's extremely high proof alcohol, pretty much pure ethanol that can be used in biofuel, can be used in cars, and then taking that and adding some water to it, putting it into a barrel, taking it out a few years later, and taking about 80 to 90% in a bottle, putting that in, and only 10 or 20% of the malt that you initially thought that you were buying. The purpose of this video was to tell you the difference between in my opinion, a single and a blend. Now I like blends and I like singles. Only since 1900s did they allow grain whiskey, which is basically corn ethanol, right? Corn ethanol to be used as a whiskey. Again, this is what fuels cars. And they somehow have allowed that in. Now, there was a book written in 1879 called The Truths About Whiskey, and that book, it goes into how the guys from, you know, John Powers and Roe and Co. and John Jameson and William Jameson, John Jameson III at the time, would never allow this into Irish whiskey, or didn't respect it, or didn't believe that it had a place. Obviously, it's got a place because it has a lighter tasting. It's still alcohol in a barrel. It still tastes nice. It's called now what's called grain whiskey. But they didn't want it to be associated with what they were doing. They didn't want it to be called whiskey. It's fine to be a spirit and people can drink it and enjoy it, much like you can drink a Calvados or you can drink a brandy, but they didn't want it to be called Irish whiskey in any way, shape or form. It now is called that, and because of that, you're seeing, because it's much lighter spirit, it's much more cost effective to produce, far cheaper to produce than the likes of a single pot still or a single malt. So what they do is they're taking 80 to 90% of a bottle of whiskey. So this one here, about 80 to 90% of that is actually this corn ethanol, this grain whiskey. And then there's only about 10 to 20% that's actually the malt that would have been this single malt. There's only about 10% of what we call single malt, or just malt, inside this, 10 to 20%, and then the rest is that grain whiskey. Same in a pot still. Do you take Jameson, for example? This is made by the same people that make Jameson. This is just a pure version of Jameson, essentially same as Redbreast. It's a pure 100% pot still from one distillery, single pot still. What Jameson is about 20% of that pot still, and then the rest of this corn grain ethanol whiskey, because it is much easier to produce, it is much lighter on the palate. So to me, I don't drink those blends as my choice. They're great to mix into cocktails. If you want to get drunk and get drunk cheaply, they're great for that too. They're great to do a shot at the bar. There's nothing wrong with a Jameson, with a proper 12, with any Irish blend or Scotch blend. Scotch were the ones that really invented that process. That's why The Truths About Whiskey was written in 1879. The Irish distillers wrote the book because the Scottish counterparts were now producing that exact method. So Johnny Walker, as I spoke about earlier, started claiming in marketing terms that they were taking the best whiskies in Scotland and making it this superpower whiskey, when in actual fact what they were doing is they were making a really, really cheap whiskey and taking a blend predominantly based of wheat or corn based ethanol that was distilled up to a really high proof. Anyway, that's what was going on then. The Irish were never going to get involved in that, and then all of a sudden by, you know, the 1960s, 1966, then Jameson all of a sudden became a blended whiskey, whereas prior, if you'd have got a cask of whiskey from John Jameson or from William Jameson, or for anyone for that matter back in the 1800s, it was pure pot still or single malt. That's the way it was back in the day, and now it's changed, and that's okay. There's nothing wrong with it. It's helped Irish whiskey get on the map. Jameson's done a great job. I have no hate whatsoever towards what Conor McGregor's doing with his proper 12, towards what Jameson have done, towards what anyone, Tullamore do is the same. It's another one of these blends. The difference being is that you just need to know what it is. You need to know what you're drinking, and you're not drinking anything close to what this is or what this might be. You're drinking really, really small amount of pot still or malt mixed with a high amount of grain whiskey. And again, there's nothing technically wrong with it. You can argue, and please in the comment section below, let me know what you think. If you think I'm an idiot, if you think I'm incorrect, then by all means pop a comment down below. I'll happily respond with my views on that. But in my humble opinion, a blended whiskey is nowhere near in the same league as these. The difference being though, is that they're not that much more expensive. So you're getting about 10% of malt to 20% of malt in this, and you're getting 100% of malt in this. Yet this might only be 40 or 50 quid, and this is gonna be still 20 or 30 quid. So this, by way of a business decision for Conor or for anyone that's doing this type of blended whiskey, there's way more profit in this than there is in this. But this, for a consumer, is far more desirable, far better. And that's why what you'll see now is, for years, Scotch whiskey has dominated the market since the 40s, 50s. But what you're starting to see now is blends are actually going down in popularity and down in sales volume, and single malts are going up. So Scotch single malt sales are going up, Irish single pot still, single malt sales are going up, and the blends are starting to come down, except for in Ireland, our blend Jameson is just going up, 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 up. And that's great. No hate on that, love what they're doing. Love all whiskey all across the board, but now you kind of get, hopefully this gives you an idea of the difference between whether it be single pot still or single malt. It's made at one distillery. Blends are blends of different things, but be careful because a blended malt is great. That's just 2 malts or 3 malts or 5 malts blended from different distilleries. That could still be a great whiskey. You're still getting 100% malt. It's just a blend. Or like what they do at Welsh Whiskey, they blend the pot still and the malt, but be careful when they're blending this grain, this cheaper whiskey, and doing it in massive volumes of 80-90% of the bottle and only 10 or 20%, which is something, for example, like that. Hope that helps. Subscribe if you liked it. So I'm gonna write in my favorite single malt that I'm drinking at the moment and my favorite blend, and I'll put that in the comment section and you do the same. I did this all in one take. I'm absolutely sure I missed some things. So yeah, throw it below and I'll be happy to chat.